When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, he wasn't just after land. He was after its industrial heart. The western regions of the USSR, now directly in the path of the German war machine, contained over a third of the nation's entire industrial capacity. These were the factories that produced the tanks, the planes, and the ammunition needed to fight back. If they fell, the Soviet war effort would be crippled, perhaps fatally. So, in the face of this unprecedented threat, Stalin's government made a decision of breathtaking audacity. If they couldn't defend the factories, they would move them. This wasn't just moving a few machines. This was the wholesale evacuation of entire industrial complexes, thousands of them along with their workers, their families, and the crucial equipment that made them run. The plan was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions, a desperate gamble against time and the advancing German army. They call it the Great Patriotic War's industrial migration, and it would become one of the most astonishing feats of the entire conflict. The order came from the top: evacuate at all costs. Immediately, a frantic, organized chaos erupted across the industrial cities of Ukraine, Belarus, and western Russia. In places like Kharkov, a major tank manufacturing hub, factory managers and workers raced against the clock. They worked around the clock, sometimes under direct artillery fire or the threat of imminent air raids, to dismantle their own workplaces. Massive lathes, presses, and assembly lines that had taken years to install were now being taken apart in a matter of days, sometimes hours. Imagine the scene: engineers frantically labeling every bolt and wire, foremen directing teams with blueprints in hand, and workers, men and women alike, using brute force and sheer determination to unbolt machinery from concrete foundations. Every piece, from the smallest gear to the largest stamping press weighing hundreds of tons, had to be meticulously cataloged and prepared for a journey of thousands of miles. The goal was to pack up everything that wasn't literally bolted to the ground, and sometimes even that was taken. The only way to move this mountain of metal was by rail. The Soviet rail network became the artery of this great migration. An endless parade of flat cars and freight trains was rerouted from all other duties to the front lines of industry. Workers loaded the heavy machinery onto the trains, often with primitive cranes or simply ramps and human muscle. Alongside the machines, they packed essential raw materials, technical documents, and even partially completed tanks or aircraft parts. The trains were packed to capacity, a jumble of industrial might on wheels. But it wasn't just metal being moved. The human element was just as crucial. Skilled workers, engineers, and technicians were irreplaceable. They were evacuated along with their factories. Families were given mere hours to pack their life's belongings and board the same trains that carried the giant machines. They were heading into the unknown, leaving their homes, their cities, everything they knew, behind. For many, it was a one-way trip. The journey east was perilous. The rail lines were prime targets for the Luftwaffe, and trains were frequently strafed and bombed. The journey was slow, cramped, and fraught with uncertainty. People lived on these trains for weeks, enduring food shortages and the constant fear of attack. The destination was the vast, remote expanse of the Soviet interior, the Ural Mountains, Siberia, Central Asia. Cities like Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Omsk, once provincial towns, were about to become the new industrial heartland of the Soviet war effort. When the trains finally arrived, the ordeal was far from over. In many cases, these factories were reassembled in the middle of nowhere. There were no buildings, no infrastructure, just open fields, often covered in snow. The Ural winters famously brutal, with temperatures plummeting to -40 degrees Celsius. Workers, driven by a mix of patriotism and desperation, began rebuilding their factories in these impossible conditions. They laid foundations in the frozen ground. They assembled machines in the open air, with their hands sticking to the freezing metal. Walls and roofs were often built around the machinery asterisk after asterisk it was already operational. Anecdotes from the time are legendary. Stories tell of production lines churning out tank parts under nothing but a canvas tarp, with workers warming their hands over open fires between shifts. They built entire cities from scratch in a matter of months. Barracks were thrown up to house the tens of thousands of displaced workers, but conditions were primitive and overcrowded. Food was severely rationed. People worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, fueled by little more than black bread and a burning desire to defeat the invaders. The slogan, "Everything for the front, everything for victory," was not just propaganda. It was a daily reality lived out in the harshest of circumstances. The workforce itself was transformed, with most able-bodied men sent to the front lines. The burden of production fell on those left behind: women, teenagers, and the elderly. Women, who had been a minority in heavy industry before the war, now made up the majority of the workforce. Teenagers, some as young as 12 or 13, were put to work on assembly lines, often standing on wooden boxes to reach the controls. They learned on the job, becoming skilled mechanics and operators out of sheer necessity. Their contribution was immense and absolutely vital to the survival of the Soviet Union. The strategic result of this monumental effort was nothing short of miraculous. By the spring of 1942, just months after the evacuation began, the relocated factories were not only operational, but were outproducing the Germans in key areas. For example, the famous T-34 tank, one of the most effective weapons of the war, was being produced in massive numbers at the newly established Tankrad in Chelyabinsk. While German industry had to contend with Allied bombing raids, Soviet production, now safely nestled 1,000 miles behind the front lines, could operate unimpeded. This industrial relocation ensured that the Red Army was never starved of the weapons it needed to fight. While the initial months of the invasion were disastrous, the ability to regenerate its industrial base gave the Soviet Union the resilience to absorb the initial blows, regroup, and eventually push the German army all the way back to Berlin. Hitler and his generals had severely underestimated this capacity. They had assumed that capturing the industrial centers in the West would lead to a swift collapse. They never anticipated that the Soviets would simply pick up their industry and move it out of reach. The scale is staggering to comprehend. In total, over 2,500 industrial enterprises were moved east. More than 1,500 of these were large-scale military factories. Along with them, over 17 million people were evacuated. This mass movement of people and production capacity has no parallel in history. It was a chaotic, brutal, and incredibly costly endeavor, paid for in human sweat and suffering. But it worked. It was a decisive factor that allowed the Soviet Union to survive the initial onslaught and ultimately triumph in the Great Patriotic War. The story of the evacuated factories is a testament to incredible logistical planning, human endurance, and the sheer will to survive against impossible odds. It reshaped the industrial map of the Soviet Union forever, and proved to be one of the most critical strategic moves of the Second World War.